thank you for the invitation to Eduardo Rosario to Experimental Sounds. Yeah, it's an honor to be sharing space with such interesting people reading fascinating texts. So, yeah, without further ado, let me. Um, sorry, I'm just gonna raise my volume some. Uh, Let me make sure. Can everyone hear me? Um, Without further ado, I'm going to get started. My name is Rohann Ayinde. Today, I'm going to be sharing a few different texts that kind of speak to my practice. I think a lot about black holes and the radical black politics. Um, and so I want to kind of give space to the various thinkers um, that form the foundation of my thought. And then I'm also going to read a excerpt from my thesis, which is on black holes and blackness. Yeah. So I want to start by reading a poem from a collection of poems by Audre Lorde. The collection is called The Black Unicorn, and this first poem in the collection is called The Black Unicorn. The black unicorn is greedy. The black unicorn is impatient. The black unicorn was mistaken for a shadow or symbol and taken through a cold country where mist painted mockeries of my fury. It is not on her lap where the horn rests, but deep in her moon pit growing. The black unicorn is restless. The black unicorn is unrelenting. The black unicorn is not free. And then I kind of want to go from there into a reading from a book by Michelle Wright. The book is called Physics of Blackness: Beyond the Middle Passage Epistemology. And this excerpt speaks a lot to what I think about in my practice, and also I think just has a lot to say about the current moment that we're in and how we have to complexify and think about the complexities that mark blackness or blacknesses as we think about them. So I'm going to read from this book. Newton's view of time built on, but also departed from, the recent work of Galileo and Descartes. Galileo had envisioned time geometrically as a line marked off at regular intervals. Newton's predecessor, Barrow, shared that vision. René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, saw time as a measure of motion, but considered the idea of duration as something subjective, a mode of thinking. Newton went further by envisioning both time and space as geometrical structures that had a real existence. Newton's universal clock ticked away at a rate independent of stars and planets, independent of our perceptions. It was simply there. It was fundamental. End quote. And this goes into the book. The central concept emphasized here is that space and time form a neat line. Space moves forward, that is, chronologically, pushed by time's natural progression. This is, in a nutshell, linear space-time. And even today, despite the contrary findings since, it dominates the Western imagination to such a degree that it is difficult to think of space and time functioning in any other fashion. Newton, by building on and confirming established concepts of time with his laws of motion, gave the linear progress narrative of time its appeal as the divine mechanism that drove God's great creation of the earth. By imagining time as a natural force that moves development forward, Newton provided Enlightenment philosophers with a stunningly simple yet compelling understanding of time through which they could interpolate Europe as the vanguard of civilization. Their resulting argument that Western civilization is more progressive than other civilizations remains a central tenet of conservative intellectual thought in the West. Indeed, this shared view of space-time as linear and more progressive in Europe may be the one shared viewpoint of the Enlightenment's alpha and omega of phenomenology, Immanuel Kant and G.W.F. Hegel. Moving against claims that Hegel opposes Newton, philosopher Terry Prickard argues, thus, like Kant, Hegel takes Newton's use of the concepts of absolute space and time as paradigmatic for how proper science is to proceed, since these concepts function in just that kind of an a priori way for Newton, although they were hardly there before Newton introduced them. Unlike Kant, of course, Hegel ascribes objective reality, not transcendental ideality, to both space and time. End quote. In other words, what is most compelling about this linear progress narrative is its transcendence, according to which it assumes a divine status because it is not controlled by earthly endeavors but operates the other way around. Time predicates motion. Even though it still holds fearsome sway today, one is hard-pressed to find a book, article, or documentary on Western civilization that does not define linearity as exemplary of progress. On closer inspection, the white Western linear progress narrative is linear only through strenuous manipulation of the facts. It is hard, for example, to claim that the European genocides and mass murders committed against Africans and Asians and in the death camps of Europe are more progressive than the barbarity sanctioned by the emperors of ancient Rome or the Spanish Inquisition. Making the line progressive requires defining European colonialism as altruistic and Nazism as a pure aberration. Exception that proves the rule of progressive white Western history. For me, it's really important that that passage of thinking about the way that time, cause, and effect is defined through a Western philosophical lens. And how we think about this idea of progress, how we think about the idea that some civilizations are considered more progressive along that narrative framework than others. And that kind of, I want that to lead into another poem from the Audre Lorde collection. And this poem is called A Song for Many Movements. Nobody wants to die on the way, caught between ghosts of whiteness and the real water. I feel like I want to read that again. Nobody wants to die on the way, caught between ghosts of whiteness and the real water. None of us wanted to leave. Our bones, on the way to salvation, 3 planets to the left, a century of light years ago. Our spices are separate and particular, but our skins sing in complementary keys. At 7:45 meantime, we were telling the same stories over and over and over. Broken down gods survive in the crevices and mudpots of every beleaguered city where it is obvious there are too many bodies to cart to the ovens or gallows, and our uses have become more important than our silence. After the fall, too many empty cases of blood to bury or burn. There will be no body left to listen, and our labor has become more important than our silence. Our labor has become more important than our silence. This is this series of thoughts for me, they fit really compellingly into a set of considerations about how blackness functions in the world, the ways that blackness function in the world, the reasons that blackness functions as it does in the world, and how it's the work of all of us specifically in this moment to analyze those myriad ways and to think about the potentials embedded in what Black life means, how Black life has been created, and what that creation is generative of for thinking about new worlds, for imagining new worlds, for living on the horizon of new worlds. And I read a quote the other day, and I'm not gonna quote the quote because I don't exactly remember what the quote was, but it was something that Angela Davis had said about the only thing that we can be in this moment is optimistic, which I think is really a powerful thing to say in a moment that holds so much heaviness as it relates to where we are, and what challenges continue to face us, have been facing us ever since the inception of a system that is built on the brutalization of certain bodies over others. From here, I wanted to read a section of my thesis. This section of the thesis is called Structuring the World Otherwise. No, sorry, that's a lie. I'm lying to you. This section of the thesis is called Exit, Arrival, and Their Horizons of Possibility. So, arriving intact is not necessarily the goal. If one arrives whole, refusing the necessary dance with a body that is made before you arrived in it, that is, a body that is called into being before you have had the opportunity to shift its weight, then you have refused to grapple with the contention upon which your existence and its history is predicated. That kind of a refusal, one might argue, is liberating, but liberation is a process of constant movement, constant navigation of the spaces that have been defined for your body to exist in, a questioning of exactly how those spaces function and shape your body, do the work of producing your body without your consent, and in turn make you, your whole, the very space you are anything but free to exist inside. Thus, to arrive whole is to arrive contained, muted and interpolated by the architectures that existed before your body became. To arrive whole is to undermine your potential for becoming, and thus for movement, and thus for liberation. To arrive whole is to forget the journey, which is a process, which is the unfurling of narratives that ripple out and make the structures you are made from, out of, into, and through which you must come to understand yourself, and how to craft a language and an environment that can challenge the constraints of wholeness. I resist wholeness because I have identified the importance of what it means to be fractal, to erupt and emerge from between, and as such to be entangled, relational, in conversation with, and multiple. The journey that precipitates this arrival, continued becoming, is written out of the face of a monolith. My arrival at the idea of a body, a history, a becoming that is not intact, was processed through the figure of blackness and the way that blackness has been structured and performed in this world as something graspable, knowable, flat. It was part of a journey made to try to understand why and how blackness, its history, and its legacy continue to shape the totality of the project of Western modernity, and how the frame of reference for understanding blackness needed to be, has to be, must be necessarily questioned and problematized. It was about pushing blackness to its many limits, and in so doing, finding the potential for what is held inside them as position, as potential, as politic, and as radical challenge to the very structures that have called them, it, blackness, into being. An arrival at blackness, or at blackness as an idea and history out of which arises the potential to challenge the project of Western modernity, needs to be framed within the context of my foundational question. And this is the question. How did slavery create the conditions for the world as we know it today? And if slavery is the generative moment out of which the contemporary West is formed, then what is the necessary rupture, event that takes us out of that structure of relations, out of this structure of relations that the West defines? For me, this question is about locating slavery as a point of genesis, realizing the ways in which it has played a foundational role in the creation of the idea of blackness, and locating it firmly at the center of the historical record as the event around which and out of which modern Western democracies function. That is to lean into the analysis of Afro-pessimism and to name the Western world as structured around the death of the black body. A world structured around black death, it contends, is a world that cannot be reformed or changed in order to recognize black bodies as human. And I feel like, let me just read that sentence again because I think that's really important. A world structured around black death, it contends, that's Afro-pessimism contends this, is a world that cannot be reformed or changed in order to recognize black bodies as human. The recognition of the black body as human, as subject, and as agent within these structures can only ever validate the very anti-blackness upon which the structures are predicated, thus reaffirming the outsideness of the black subject and continuing to perpetuate the anti-blackness that Western society is structured around. I lean into this analysis precisely because the work of arriving, journeying, is necessarily rooted in and rooted through an analysis that refuses the conditions upon which this world is based and asks what it means to exit, what that exit looks like, and what can be done to create the potential conditions for that exit. The language of exit, however, is not to be understood within the context of an escapism from and a refusal to engage with the frameworks within which we come to understand ourselves. Rather, it should be contextualized within the rubric of the potential embedded in and understood relative to blackness as a set of positions out of which new horizons are plotted. Horizons that necessarily plot themselves outside of and adjacent to the architectures that have shaped our modernity. To think exit is to think similarly to Saidiya Hartman's rendering of the wayward. It is to think about how the journey to an outside of is already part of the fabric of a black space-time, that the logics forced onto and into the bodies of black people become and give shape to the illogics necessary to imagine and live in the imagined space beyond the confines of this world. Indeed, the refusal to see the black body as a subject, as a human, as the bearer of a potential other than death, is the rub that produces it as always already free from the limited and stunted position that the West has produced for envisioning a world in which people might live with one another in liberation. If I arrived at the importance of an exit, it was always in conversation with the idea of an entrance. To think blackness as the idea, the construct, the structure produced to enter a world organized around its oppression and death is to think the world we live in as designed and built with violence against black bodies as a founding principle. The logic of this violence is undeniable and is woven as tightly into the knit of contemporary society as any other idea. Without the creation of the black body, there is no modernity. Without the death of millions of Africans, whether enslaved in the colonies or colonized in their homelands, there is no Western hegemony. The ability to create, accumulate, and wield wealth cannot be untangled from the labor of black bodies, the death of black bodies, and the refusal to recognize black bodies as part of the construct of the human. Nah, blackness was necessarily constructed as outside the project of the human in order to justify the use of black bodies as beasts of labor. And so the entry point, the framework that saturates every single institution that functions in the West today, is rooted in that initial refusal and that persistent violence. It's the kind of violence that persists for multiple reasons, but primarily because the system of labor that was organized around it required, and will always require, a refusal to recognize certain people as human. This psychic myth is what anti-blackness is, and is what makes anti-blackness the frame we must use to analyze a range of ways in which peoples are subjugated to violence by the state and the dialogues that produce subjects of the state. My arrival at blackness, then, has always been through a questioning of the terms that make my black black, and a question as to what the potential of that black holds, not only for me, not only for my person, not only for my community, but also for the world. My analysis has always been through a Marxist lens while trying to grapple with what has been missing from it. Something that, because it was missing, ultimately undermines the potential for dismantling the global hegemony of capitalism. Without recognizing and taking into consideration the position that anti-blackness plays in the construct of capitalism, there is no way that we can dismantle, deconstruct, rupture, change, exit the sets of relations that enmesh us and barrel us further and further into the throes of a world that refuses to recognize how it has arrived where it has. The sickness, which is actually the pervasive condition of our contemporary historical moment, is anti-blackness. When we perform the blacknesses that anti-blackness generates, we further fortify the entrenched systems that function through the economy of death and violence that shape the architectures of modernity. This investigation, this piece of writing, this idea that I'm probing into, is about locating the genesis of a blackness that refuses, and by refusing unsettles, the foundations of the architectures that have constructed it as flat and one-dimensional in its position. Instead, it asks us to move in and out of the ways that blackness has been theorized, lived, and experienced, and to look at the richness of that archive. An archive which holds the topographic dimensions for constructing/accessing an adjacent world outside of the inside of this world. To think to lose here, I'm interested in the fold of blackness and how, in its relationship to the outside of the human, it contains another inside, or an otherwise, that might be thought of as a through, or an in, or a with, that necessarily reorganizes the language of what it means to be. It is the reorganization of language that happens the shift. That's one section from a larger piece of work that I wrote last year, or finished last year. Took a couple of years to write, and I think it leads really well into this next piece that I want to read. That is from the book Art on My Mind, Visual Politics by Bell Hooks, and I think whenever I'm reading, whenever I'm thinking, whenever I'm especially engaged with a black liberatory politics, um, I want to always kind of pay homage to black radical thinkers, and specifically black women radical thinkers who have pushed forward so many narratives and um, have allowed us, have given us, have shared a particular language with those of us who engaged in imagining worlds outside of the world that we live in. I think that's why I read from Audre Lorde. That's why I'm reading from Bell Hooks now. That's why I was reading Michelle Wright. I really think that there's a lot of importance in black feminist thought, and I don't say that lightly. Yeah, and so I want to read this next piece, or part of a piece, is from an essay by Bell Hooks, and the essay is called "Black Vernacular: Architecture as Cultural Practice." And I think one of the things I'm thinking about in my work is the way that there are particular architectures that hold on to and to continue to structure our lives in ways that perpetuate the violences that we have come to accept as normal, the violence of anti-blackness. And so this part of the essay goes like this. Few critics have attempted to look at poor and working class black folks' relationship to space. We need studies of housing that talk about the way in which the construction of projects, state-owned and designed dwellings for the economically disadvantaged, brought an end to the dwelling in shacks that allowed for individual creativity and assertion of aesthetic engagement with space and one's environment. The state-built dwellings erase all chances for unique perspectives to shape living space and replace these with a blueprint of sameness. Everyone's place structured similarly. Clearly, these structures inform the ways poor folk are allowed to see themselves in relation to space. No matter how poor you were in the shack, no matter if you owned the shack or not, there you could allow your needs and desires to articulate interior design and exterior surroundings. Poverty could not be viewed as a circumstance that suppresses creativity and possibility, for all around you were expressions of unique sensibility. Standardized housing brought with it a sense that to be poor meant that one was powerless, unable to intervene in or transform in any way one's relationship to space. In many areas of the rural South, the shack still remains as a dwelling that counters and subverts the messages of this dehumanization of the spatial imagination of folks who are not materially privileged. Mapping a cultural genealogy of resistance, we can see ways poor African Americans use their imaginations to transcend limits. This history increasingly becomes subjugated knowledge as black folks embrace notions of victimhood that suggest our reality can be defined only by the circumstances of our oppression. In the essay Race and Architecture, the philosopher and cultural critic Cornel West suggests that, I begin quote, the major challenge of a new architectural historiography is that its conception of the past and present be attuned to the complex role of difference, nature, primitive, ruled, Dionysian, female, black, and so on, end quote. To rise to this challenge, spaces must exist for us to think and talk about and theorize architecture as it reflects and informs culture. In this expansive and more inclusive understanding of architecture, the vernacular is as relevant as any other form of architectural practice. This perspective allows critics to theorize black experience in ways that promote documentation of our historical and contemporary relationship to space and aesthetics. Few scholars theorize black experience from a standpoint that centralizes the perspective of poor and working class folks. Yet to ignore this standpoint, is to reproduce a body of work that is neo-colonial insofar as it violently erases and destroys those subjugated knowledges that can only erupt, disrupt, and serve as acts of resistance if they are visible, remembered. Documentation of a cultural genealogy of resistance invites the making of theory that highlights the cultural practices which transform ways of looking and being in a manner that resists reinscription by prevailing structures of domination. Subversive historiography connects oppositional practices from the past with forms of resistance in the present, thus creating spaces of possibility where the future can be imagined differently, imagined in such a way that we can witness ourselves dreaming, moving forward and beyond the limits and confines of fixed locations. That's the end of the scripted pieces of writing and reading that I wanted to share. But I do have another 4 minutes, and in that 4 minutes, I'm actually gonna read another very short part of my thesis. I think to close out what I'm saying and to kind of give you a sense of maybe how a black radical politics and this theory of the black hole I'm thinking about come together. And so this part of the text is called Structuring the World Otherwise, the Philosophical Economy of the Black Hole. At the heart of this project, at the center of where I am trying to emerge, what I am trying to emerge, is a reflection on the conditions of being. One of the concepts that resonated with me when I began researching the black hole was the practice of interferometry. Interferometry describes a technique through which images or data sets are produced as a result. Interferometry describes a technique through which images or data sets are produced as a result of combining signals to create a more accurate or complex image than could be achieved through using one signal by itself. Ultimately, it uses a multiplicity of signals to produce an image unrivaled in clarity. For imaging Pawawi, which is the name of the black hole that was imaged last year, the radio signals from each of the EHT's 8 telescopes were focused simultaneously with aching precision to create a telescope that was as large as the space between all 8 of them. EHT is the project that imaged the black hole last year. There is something deeply compelling about thinking through the methodology that allowed for this image to be made. It acts as another constituent part of the ideas I am thinking through, and also acts as a structuring logic for thinking about this project. Thinking about Michelle Wright's discussion on how to come to a more complex understanding of blackness, and thinking how to philosophically reconfigure how we produce knowledge about any subject, object. It becomes one part of the methodological way of thinking through the black hole, not only as object, but also as a figure that produces a new kind of simultaneous collaboration in order to be even tangentially understood. If one takes the politics of how the EHT came to capture the black hole, one can begin to inhabit a world in which horizontal decision-making, conversation, collaboration, and radical accountability marked a multi-year project. That's not to say that the EHT was some utopian collaboration without its own set of difficulties or untouched by larger societal inequalities related to who the people working on the project were and what privileges allowed them to be in that position to begin with. However, it is to take the black hole as fulcrum around which new sets of ideas and new ways of engaging around the production and dissemination of knowledge are produced. It is to locate the black hole as not only a scientific material reality, but also as a becoming entity in a fluid relationship with the production of ideas that challenge and reconstitute the way we both understand and approach our relationship to the world and the cosmos. This is where the importance of a black radical position comes in for reading the philosophical economy of the black hole and creating the conditions through which reading the black hole as such is a radical and reconfigurative practice. if the way in which we continue trying to learn and study the black hole is not mediated through the lens of a politics with a commitment to imagining the world otherwise, then the production of new knowledge around the black hole will inevitably be commandeered to the same neo-colonial and exploitative ends that the architectures of modernity promote and are founded in. Thank you so much for listening in. Once again, give thanks for being part of this and look forward to hearing what everyone else has to share for the rest of the program. Peace.